Okay, my name's Pete. I work at Kinetic as a senior cyber intrusion analyst. I've been in this role for about 2 years. Just to note, my views and opinions are my own and don't necessarily represent those of my employer. So, in my day job, what do? I've got a number of roles and responsibilities. Aside from leading a team of analysts, my primary responsibilities are analysis and triage of incidents and escalating those to our clients. Capability development, so this is reviewing our current detection capabilities, identifying any gaps in our alerting and enhancing these to mitigate these. And the key thing is the adversary techniques. So this is developing awareness of the TTPs, what are the bad guys doing out there, how will they exploit vulnerabilities, bypass our detection methods, and so on. And the final thing is, the important part is the training and mentoring. So I spend a lot of time with the analysts, especially the junior guys, doing one-to-one mentoring. So this could be anything from how to use the tools that we have for doing triage, analysis, etc., doing assessments, are they maintaining that awareness, how do they fit on the career path, so on. And also running CTF exercises, so that's a good measure. But that's been replaced by our 24/7 lab access systems now. So I work in a SOC that's providing 24/7 security monitoring. So we're a managed security service provider, so we have a number of external clients that we monitor. And it's very much a frontline operations environment, so we are dealing with real incidents, and it can be quite pressurised, especially when we've got a lot of clients, incidents happening, how do we prioritise those incidents, etc. So there's been a lot of interest in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix in the past year or two, especially what it is, how to adopt as part of threat hunting, use for validation, etc. And you've seen lots of mention of it in the previous slides and the presentations. So I'm going to be covering the MITRE ATT&CK matrix from a more practical aspect, how we've used it, what my experience is of it, and more specifically on Windows host, as using the SYSMON configuration, and how we can actually use that as part of a security monitoring service. So the reason for adopting SYSMON on the attack matrix really was to use the available features within Windows without actually introducing new technology. And we just wanted to complement our existing implementation. So the previous presentation covered a lot about the attack matrix principles and what it is, the origins of it, etc. So I'm not going to cover that too much in detail, but I will provide some context of how we've used it, why I was interested in it. But before we jump into the attack matrix on the 6-month config, I'm going to go back to basics, just to say why do we need monitoring, the need for it, and some of the challenges that we face, especially from a security analyst point of view. And then I'll move on to the attack matrix. That will cover the deployment aspects, and focus a bit more on SYSMON, some use cases that I've used to validate it. And then finally I'll cover the lessons identified and the opportunities and where we're going to take this in the future. So security monitoring, doing intrusion analysis, incident response, they all have a need to capture or understand actions against IT systems. So going back to absolute basics, why do we need to monitor our systems? What threats are we looking for, etc. So in this case here, Rob JOYCE, who led the Tailored Access Organisation as part of the NSA, he was a team responsible for advanced exploitation of IT systems, gave a rare presentation at the Usenix Enigma conference a few years ago, and he was just basically giving an education to computer security professionals and academics about how to keep people like him and his team and other threat actors out of our system. So one of the key statements that caught my eye was the bit I've underlined. So it's basically their fear is a system administrator who actually looks at the logs, understands what they mean, and understands how it applies to the context of their system. So at the end of the day, an IT system is providing some function or service. We don't deploy IT systems for the fun of it. And so we've heard all of the CIA, confidentiality, integrity and availability. So a system administrator or a network defender should be able to look at the logs, be able to determine what impact is having on any of those. So we've established that logging is important, but what do we log? So malware Jake, he's a SANS instructor and he provides this recommendation for Windows logging. I agree, log what you can. Storage is cheap, but there's a cost with everything. And I think it was highlighted earlier on that the cost can be, if you log everything, you probably start clogging up your network bandwidth, while storage is cheap. But once you start factoring in archiving, backups, and then all your processing overheads in terms of processing that data and managing it and parsing it, it starts to become quite costly. And it could impact the end user experience as well if you're capturing too much log data from your endpoint. So quite often, from my experience, system administrators don't configure the log sources properly, and they don't provide the correct logs. So, for example, they'll provide the logs for the test environment, but not the production environment. And then we end up getting blind spots on the network. So from a network defender point of view, if you collect too much logs, you could end up DOSing your SIEM by overwhelming it with logs. And then of course the SIEM struggle to catch up, then loses your near real-time capability. So you can mitigate this somewhat by tuning the endpoints, what logs you're collecting, and to get the right balance between collecting the right level of logs to support an instant response. But there are a lot of factors when it comes into play when monitoring environments, especially when you're dealing with disconnected users, poor comms, etc. So we need to log events. How do we get the balance right? So that we're logging the relevant items so that security analysts or system administrator can go back to it and replay and understand what's been captured. There are a number of frameworks out there that define critical security controls, such as SANS SOC 20. There's some legacy controls, such as Good Practice Guide number 13, that provide guidance on what event to capture, and you can use that to check your log sources to make sure you're capturing the right events. But sometimes frameworks aren't enough. Sometimes the vendors of the appliances don't log all the activity that you need to capture. So you have to think out of the box and exploit other data sources. And the other issue, system administrators, they use default logging policy just straight out of the box, and that might not capture all the events that you need to capture. There is some help. The NCSC have provided a really helpful resource called Logging Made Easy. It's a set of baseline configuration profiles for Windows systems that provides recommended GPOs, SYSMON config, etc. And there's a presentation about this later on today. I recommend you attending that. So I'm going to be focused on the MITRE attack matrix and SYSMON. So I've talked about security monitoring, briefly why we might need it, and the approaches to logging. So I'm now going to be talking about why we provide monitoring and discuss what we're trying to achieve using the attack matrix, and then that can be incorporated as part of a monitoring solution. So much of our enterprise now is becoming more interconnected. So we've seen traditional activities such as using on-premises email, all the way up to users doing system administration and so on. But the boundary is changing. There are third-party external services, cloud-based stuff, etc. Compliance checks, all these checks are becoming more evident. But for the security analysts, malware and adversary behavior is getting harder to detect, especially if they leverage multiple techniques. And as part of an incident escalation, we're finding that the client operational security team, the system that we monitor, are demanding more contextual information about the incident. How did the attack occur? What is the likely impact? Etc. So a good security analyst, in my opinion, should be maintaining awareness of threats, adversary tactics, as this will help them know good from bad. And, for example, know what Windows features look like, legitimate use of those features. So is PowerShell with basics for encoding good behavior? So the pyramid of pain, I always refer to this illustration when I'm discussing with the security analyst and what we should be aiming for. So there's a lot of emphasis on IOCs. But as mentioned earlier on, IOCs can be discarded, entire infrastructure rebuilt, software components redeveloped. It's expensive for the adversary, but it's doable. What is harder is recreating the TTPs. This is effectively the tradecraft, how the adversary operates. Changing this requires significant investment in new skills, new approaches to attacks. So this is effectively rebuilding a new team with potentially new people and new skill sets. But this is where something like MITRE ATT&CK matrix comes into play, as this is focused at the TTP level. So to understand TTPs, ideally threat intelligence reports should provide this knowledge, but as highlighted earlier on, and what I'm going to say is that at the moment TI reports are very heavily focused on IOCs. We are getting more context around those IOCs, how adversaries are operating, etc. But another reason why we're not getting a full detail is that it could be that the evidence wasn't captured as part of the incident, i.e. not logged or not observed, or it could be that certain information being withheld because there's ongoing investigations, etc. So simply focusing on Windows endpoints, just looking at a clean build of Windows 10, 32-bit version, you can see from this illustration that there are a lot of EXEs, DLLs and a few COM files. And this doesn't include the program files folder or other any custom installed applications. So why am I bringing this up? So from an adversary point of view, why build tools when you can use living off the line techniques or exploit the Windows features on the operating system? But the fundamental question is, if we've got all of these components and we've got Windows host on our network, where do we focus our attention? Where do we prioritize everything we do? What techniques do we focus on? And how do we do this in a consistent manner? So the previous presentation titled the ATT&CK framework for threat hunting gave an excellent introduction to this, and it covered a lot about prioritization. So I'll just quickly go through the MITRE ATT&CK matrix been gaining popularity in the last year or so, but it came to my attention at least 18 months ago, probably a bit longer, and I've been using this for a variety of purposes. So point number one, as a learning resource, so to develop situational awareness of adversary TTPs, because it was a good point of reference and it was well documented against APTs. Number two, emulating the adversary. I regenerate some of those techniques on research labs to gain insights, what gets generated in log files, what gets generated on the host. And that's really useful for validating detection, especially if you've got existing controls in place. And then number three was testing vendor solutions. So vendors have started incorporating the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, part of their alert profiles, etc. So we plugged that in and started throwing stuff at it. So it was a good way to do a little bit of validation to understand the coverage. But going back to the pyramid of pain, the ATT&CK framework provides a focus on adversary TTPs. So the matrix itself is a really good reference, and it's been continually updated with new TTPs and references. So I talked about what the challenges are and what we're trying to achieve. But how do we use the ATT&CK matrix as a way of detecting adversary behavior? So I use SYSMON for the time being. So this is part of the SYS internal suite, developed by Mark Rusnovich from Microsoft. So I needed something that was fairly non-intrusive, but provides increased visibility of the endpoint. So I had someone say, why not just deploy EDR? So because we're an MSSP, we don't necessarily have well, we can't have the ability to actually interrogate client networks, so we just act as a receiver. And there's various reasons for that. So different clients have different infrastructure set up, different requirements and so on. But as a SYSMON agent, it creates Windows events, and it's using the existing log sources. So we can integrate this using an extra log source without too much reconfiguration of our monitoring solutions. The other motivation is it's a Microsoft developed software component, and it's actually maintained, with new features being added, etc. So recently I've been using SYSMON version 9, but last year I was using version 8. That was a game changer in my view, because some of the features added was the ability to configure tags to specific observed events. So before SYSMON version 8, I was trying to find the best method of mapping SYSMON events to the attack matrix techniques. So one method was creating the mappings in the SIEM, but I felt this was a wrong approach. It was kind of doing it at the top end once all the logs had come in. But in my view, I think the log events should be classified as close as possible to the log source. The other issue, the SIEMs have a lot of parsing rules anyway to process and tag logs. So this would introduce an extra overhead on processing the logs, and it could impact the performance of them. So, for example, in audit logs such as Windows, Cisco, Snort, IDS logs, and so on, when events get logged in there, there's usually like a vendor ID or a descriptor or so on to indicate what that event is. So that's what I was trying to achieve. So when SYSMON version 8 came out, I started using the SwiftOn Security SYSMON config to start tagging the events. But then someone else had the same idea as me. So a chap called Olaf, he used SwiftOn Security SYSMON config file, but expanded this using the tags feature. So I used this as the basis of my setup, but started customizing it a little bit. So you can see the use of tags there, followed by the condition for the match. There are a number of configuration parameters in SYSMON. So like using the parent calling process, the image name, looking at registry keys, etc. You can exclude items as well. So that effectively acts as a filter. So this is good for filtering out noise of safe applications and so on. But I caveat that by safe, I mean these are applications such as antiviruses. Some applications just naturally generate a lot of noise, especially if they're updating. But what you don't want to be doing is excluding safe applications that could be used legitimately, but also as a technique. So it could be part of a living off the land technique. So you need to be careful. I did have a customized configuration. Could be used third-party components such as different AVs, log forwarders, and so on. So this is for those not familiar with SYSMON, this is what a SYSMON event looks like. But this has got the attack matrix config applied. So when an event comes in, gets observed by the SYSMON agent, and it gets dumped into the Windows event log. So if you look in the Windows event view, that's what you see on the left. So you can see an example there that rule, what's been triggered is the SYSMON and user discovery rule. And the command line info relates to the systeminfo.exe. So effectively this is an application built in Windows that grabs the system information such as build, owner details, hardware configuration, IP addresses, etc. That technique's been mapped against the attack matrix web page on the bottom right. So you can get other interesting attributes as well out of the SYSMON config. But it's useful to do that mapping. So, but how did it look like from a logging perspective? So you can see it on the bottom right. So that's a raw event. So it looks quite different from what you see in a Windows event. So you get XML tags, etc. So the SIEM I used only had out-of-the-box parsing rules just for plain vanilla SYSMON. but I wanted to use it for the attack matrix rule features. So extracting out the rules, then I could exploit that. So I had to generate my own parser effectively. So you can see on the top screen, you can see the SYSMON event gets parsed out, classified, then the key attributes get put into the respective event field. So from a correlation point of view, we can then start to correlate the hashes. They can be used against threat intelligence feeds. Then we can start basic IOC mapping. But then we can start build more complex rules by looking for sequences of events that fit part of the wider TTPs and alert against dangerous odd activity. So there's another limitation that you might face, because SYSMON event, you capture so much information in there. Your tools might be limited in how much information you can exploit. So it's something to be aware of, how you base your correlation on that. The classification itself is usually SIEM specific, so most parse raw log events into a classification, then you can use that as wider correlation. So in this case, so there's a number of utilities and applications that are triggered, but they've been classified as process service start. But the actual rule name and the ID, you can see it there. So just to recap, SYSMON is installed on the Windows host, and this is installed as a driver. Then there's a service loaded, which has that configuration file. Which has the events we're not interested in, then these are classified. Then the events are captured as part of a Windows log file, and these are forwarded to a centralized log server, along with all the other logs from all the other hosts. And then usually, in a typical security monitoring setup, you would have an agent or log forwarder on there, and that would forward it onto the SIEM, where it does all the aggregation and processing of the logs. Then the SIEM will parse those as well. So if an event doesn't match a configuration, a technique that's been programmed in the config, then it'll be classified as a catch-all. So you can see here at the bottom left, there's no mapping. So there could be various reasons for that. It could be that it's a new application installed on there, it's not being used, or it could be a new feature what's been added to Windows. So in service packs, updates, there's always new applications being added. So this example did get parsed, but it's a general catch-all. So the key thing to look out for from a security monitoring point of view is to look out for a lot of these catch-all events. My advice would be to set up like an alarm, so if you start getting too many, so there's probably features being used. But in this case, it's because SYSMON was deployed on a host that had a SQL server, what was installed, and the SQL agent.exe didn't feature in the config file. It's event number 18 in SYSMON, which relates to a pipe connected from a client to the server. But analysis of the application, it was legit, so it got whitelisted and effectively excluded in the config file. But this is usually standard onboarding. Tuning activity, you do log sources. You do that with any type, not just SYSMON. You start getting events that don't match, and then they get caught by a catch-all rule. It could be issues with parsers as well, and then you start looking for key attributes and start understanding the context around that. So the key resources that I used for deployment of SYSMON was CALDERA. So that's a tool that I first came across early last year. It's now on version 2. It's a recent release. So it's developed by the same team that came up with the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. The development team has significantly changed the platform. But I'm using the first release, but I am migrating to version 2 that came out just over a month ago. The Atomic Red Canary GitHub repository provides a number of techniques as well, which is in addition to the attack matrix framework as well. And it's good for validating the SYSMON config, correlation rules, etc. So how is my setup configured for all of this? So I had a standalone environment for research. So this was a lab environment. It was comprised of Windows Server, multiple Windows clients such as version 7, 10, 32-bit, 64-bit, etc. I didn't focus on specific build versions or anything like that, but the environment was purely used for experimental and concept and development. So it was an excellent environment for running CALDERA on against these lab VMs. I didn't have a SIEM set up in that environment, but we did make use of Security Union, especially like the ATT&CK, to correlate the logs and be able to do very basic search and correlation of the events. Then I had a separate test and reference environment that had the SIEM on it. So that was representative of builds of production environments and so on. But it didn't have CALDERA installed on that. So that environment was fine for deploying and testing the SYSMON configuration, be able to undertake some very basic level validation of the TTPs, for example, use living off the land techniques. But what I couldn't do was deploy any malware or do any destructive techniques. That would have to take place on a research environment. The production environment we focus on with a client monitored estate that we were keen to enhance the monitoring of. So we deploy SYSMON and our config on this environment. But I only did that on a very small scale to start with as part of a pilot. And we focus on some critical assets. So these were around jump boxes, those kind of assets. But as part of that pilot, I'm just purely interested in getting feedback from the system administrators, from people who use those assets on performance, and also to understand the login into the SIEM. So going back to my earlier point, what I didn't want to do is deploy SYSMON everywhere and start getting flooded with SYSMON events. I wanted to get a feel for what it was like, deploying it on some production hosts, different types, then see if I needed to tune out any noise, etc. There was some limitations, like the research lab and the testing and reference didn't have any pattern of life capability. So it was very much the analyst generating the event, looking in the logs, seeing what occurred. It wasn't really stress testing the config or validating any of the correlation rules. There was a fourth environment that was set up for a honeypot, and that was just a very, very short period. And that was pretty much a Windows host set up with RDP exposed, and that was running SYSMON, and then we were just interested in see how that was being used in the wild, so to speak. Just to understand what type of people were using it and what they were trying to do on the host. So generally, SYSMON is lightweight. However, if you have really poor config, or you're looking extensively for certain activities, or if a host is extremely busy, it can make SYSMON run hot a little bit. I've only ever had one instance of this. It was on one host, and there was a 30% CPU spike. I tuned the config. I reduced the need for computing all the hashes and just focused on SHA-1. But apart from that, I've had no other issue with any other host. So I've talked about what SYSMON is, briefly what the attack matrix is, the configuration and deployment, and a little bit about the SIEM integration. So I'm now going to cover the validation, understand what events get alerted, some of the blind spots, and some real-world usage. So back 18 months ago, a bit longer, I started with CALDERA. So this was the first tool that I used in conjunction with the attack matrix. And so I'd literally deployed this on the research lab, and it was very much running that against some Windows VMs and just educating the analyst. These are the types of techniques, this is what gets generated, and so on. This is a very basic example. So the blue dot on the center screen just shows one host, and that's represented by a blue circle. So that's a Windows host, and that has the CALDERA agent installed. Then the CALDERA server interacts with this agent to invoke various actions. So the screenshot is the server, and when you run an operation, it mimics the adversary behavior, such as a human operator or any automated activity. So CALDERA is deployed on a research lab. So whilst the documentation says that it can be deployed on a production environment because it's got like an auto cleanup ability, this particular release is shipped with Mimikat. So Mimikat is credential dumping. I wouldn't deploy it on a production environment because that would probably trigger your existing AV or other sensors. But in theory you could. So just running out-of-the-box Adversary using CALDERA on standard out-of-the-box Windows, no configuration, nothing. If you fire one of the CALDERA network operations, it's all done in 2 minutes, and there's a number of activities that happen. As you can see from the screenshots, if you look at the application security and SYSMON logs, hardly anything gets generated, and you might not even see any events. So within that 2 minutes, so that actor, what was being mimicked, it conducted host and network survey, and it's dumped credentials, but you're not really seeing that. If you did tweak the login policies, you would see some more, but you're never going to see everything. The one on the bottom left, the system one, is part of the CALDERA config. So what it does, it bootstraps the agent, which effectively acts on behalf of CALDERA server in order to mimic the actions. But if you look at the SYSMON events, you can see there's more SYSMON activity. So validating SYSMON attack techniques in CALDERA is especially useful. You can start to map events and the operation detailed on the left. With the SYSMON events that you see in the Windows event logs, then you should start to see a correlation between the activity, and then you can start to do some tuning out as well if it's excessive noise. So in the middle screenshot, you can see the system owner user discovery that I talked earlier about, using the SYSMON system info command. Then on the bottom right, you've got the command line interface. So that's quite an interesting classification. So it's been marked as rule name command line interface. But if you look at the command line attribute, you can see that it's trying to scan directories for word password in the titles. So yes, you could create specific rules and look for that kind of thing, but it is using the command function to do that, like a directory. And if you do came up with specific rules, where do you start drawing the line? Do you start looking for people searching for users, computer names, different language terms? It's a lot. But it's not a 100% match, but from a system analyst point of view, the activity did look suspicious. Validation in CALDERA is fine to a certain point, but there are some limitations. For example, no pattern of life. Then there's fixed TTPs. Eventually you just run out against techniques to test against unless you start developing your own. At that point, I decided to deploy an honeypot. So that was deliberately insecure. So I had very poor RDP settings. I use common account names, very weak passwords, etc. And then I use well-known accounts that have been used and so on. And then from this, I observed a number of attempts and several compromises. So it was quite good to see some activity in the SYSMON and the attack matrix rules firing. So the most common activity, when a host compromised and so on, was the attempt to gain privilege escalation. So that was by discovering all the accounts on the box. It kind of makes sense in a way. You're getting to a host, the first thing you want to do is get privilege escalation and be able to do other things. So there were attempts at dumping the local security authority subsystem service, getting stuff from memory and so on. But then I saw a number of false positives, such as SVC hosts interacting with the same process. So it needed a bit of tuning, but it was useful. Then I saw other things such as disabling of security tools. So I thought, oh, that's a technique, that sounds quite clever. But actually it was a legit event, and that was Microsoft Defender downloading updates, and then it would restart the agent. So again, tuning opportunity, but it could get me thinking. if that's a legit event, could an adversary do that kind of thing? So that was the command used at the bottom. I didn't run the honeypot for long because at the same time, roughly, the RDP vulnerability was disclosed. So there was a lot of probing and scanning and everything happening. So I just shut it down after a short while. It was a useful exercise and provided some external validation. Interestingly, I grabbed all the usernames, and there were some interesting usernames being used, such as Linda, Debbie, Tracy, French version of administrator, and then there was some HVAC and other kinds of stuff. So it's quite interesting. So QUASER. So this is a tool that's been doing around for quite a while. There is a US advisory, screenshot on the top right. It's a tool that's available on GitHub and source code provided. And it's a tool that's been used by various APTs. So again, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to test, see how QUASER appears in SYSMON and how it's classified against the attack matrix. So we have a server at the top screen that acts as a controller, and that provides the remote access to the client, and the client is a payload that connects to the server. So the initial operation on the left doesn't reveal anything exciting other than that the process started. The event didn't even get classified. You can see the file name, filedoc.exe. So that establishes a connection connected to the server. So in terms of remote access, there's a number of things we can do. So next step was, let's grab some system information. That didn't seem to trigger any events at all, which is quite surprising. No activity seen. Then I thought, right, I'll try remote shell. That did trigger an event, and you can see the command access and the technique name again. And the command process was invoked. But interestingly, then it was followed by a change code page utility that was invoked. So doing a bit of malware analysis, I confirmed that both of these commands do get invoked as part of that feature. So it's quite useful to start daisy chaining events. So, but the key thing is not a substitute for an AV. So a good antivirus should detect QUASER without being installed. But like I said, source code's out there. People can download it, tweak it, change features, obfuscate it, and so on. But if they're still using the same techniques what's been employed in the core of the QUASER, these could be indicators by using the command and change code page events. So I started looking at Windows features, Windows subsystem for Linux. So really good feature. It enables you to run Linux kernel within Windows. SYSMON didn't detect any activity related to that feature. Kind of makes sense. It's looking for Windows binary and Windows OS related activity. But it's a blind spot because if its feature is enabled, you can do a lot of the Linux type features such as ipconfig, ifconfig, and so on. DOS discovery, it just won't trigger. But the equivalent Windows commands would. Next one, an individual going by the name of Sandbox Escaper released several 0 days back in May on GitHub. In my opinion, there should have been a bit more responsible disclosure on these, rather than just dumping them on GitHub. But they deployed them. But interestingly, from my experience, we have some clients who are monitoring requirements which like detect 0 day activity. In my opinion, I find those requirements quite difficult to detect, especially when you've got an enterprise network, you've got a multitude of devices. So it's not just about looking for 0 days on Windows hosts. It could be your routers, your WAN, backup devices, everything. But interestingly, the attack matrix is based on a classification of known TTPs. So this is fairly unknown but I'm looking for see how this maps against the known TTPs. It'll be interesting to see how this configuration worked. So, just for information for those not familiar, the exploit against a scheduled task using a legacy Windows job object, and it effectively promotes a non-admin to a system-level privilege. So it's a local privilege escalation. Executing a payload shows the process crate on the left. You can see the scheduled task being invoked, and then finally you see the job completing. And that would, the third step shows the command line interface rule. Then you can see the scheduled task being invoked again. And the final thing, you can see the job completed in step 4. And that would grant the user local privilege escalation. But it's not immediately clear what impact running that code has had. So you'd have to still correlate against other log sources. But because the two events, command line interface, another activity should be enough to trigger, but because a lot of these didn't get classified, it would be effectively classed as a catch-all. You would have to go into that. And that kind of brings us to my next point. What happens if you discover all of these? You get a number of events that are being classified as catch-all. From a security analyst, they should be start documenting that, start understanding what command that was, why it was run, what impact did that have, and then they could start developing their TTPs. And then to start updating the config, and then it starts maturing what you're classifying in SIEM. But the good thing is Microsoft has patched this vulnerability, so it's not an issue so much, this exploit, but it's still useful techniques to look out for. So from doing all of this, working out the use of SYSMON, applying the attack matrix, deploying it, and doing some validation. So what were the pitfalls? Correlating events is challenging and still something that we're developing. The main issue is maintaining balance and not triggering too many false positives, because a lot of these techniques use legitimate reason for it as well as malicious use. So some of we're not just using the real name, but we often use some of the attributes as well. Other forms of correlation is using the event classification, slightly higher abstraction, but it's doable. The validation of the SYSMON configuration was done in quick succession. So CALDERA, press the button, bang, within 1 or 2 minutes, it generates all the adversary artifacts, it's done all the bad stuff. In reality, an adversary could be on the platform or the host for a lot longer. They could do the initial compromise, then maintain persistence, then it could be days, weeks, months before it start exploiting other vulnerabilities, doing other activity. So it could be slow burn activity. The other weak area is TI. CALDERA has a number of built profiles for actors and behaviours. We started to develop our own, but then we hit a roadblock. The TI out there just didn't provide us enough TTPs in order to mature the techniques that we're trying to do. So deploying SYSMON, using the attack matrix, TTPs in a one-step process, and I think that's been highlighted earlier on. It needs to be a continuous review of TTPs, and develop a correlation rule, review the TI emerging from those TTPs. So there are a lot of different attack vectors, features being added to Windows all the time, and that potentially opens up to new vulnerabilities and exploits. There's no shortcuts. You need to continue to more those, mature those, understand the environment, etc. But TI is getting better. It's moving away from IOCs, and TTPs are starting to become more common now in TI reports. So you can see the FireEye report starting to do mapping against TTPs, and it's really good. And it gives you, the analyst, a better insight of what adversary to use and what techniques they're developing. So it fits quite nicely with the pyramid pane I talked about earlier on. So hybrid analysis is another one. It's doing mappings as part of an artifact analysis. So it's more focused on the software side, and it provides detailed view of the artifact. It's useful to look at, and you can do some basic correlation. But again, it's not a substitute for an AV. So defensive measures, SYSMON provides no defensive measures at all. However, you can provide some hardening by restricting the config file. So if your adversary discovers that config file, it could be a bit game over. They could understand what you're looking for, or you're detecting it, and so on. But there are some pitfalls to look out for as well, such as poor configuration. You end up excluding too much activity that you need to capture, and even like using SYSMON and so on. Other thing to look out for would be changes to the SYSMON driver or service state, such as stopping and starting, and that will effectively stop your feed. But generally, on all the hosts that I've seen SYSMON, they've always been event generating of some sort. Lessons identified. Don't expect SYSMON config to capture all your events. Like I said, you'll get CATCHALL, you need to have a look at those. The analysts need to be understanding what's being reported in those, start developing hypotheses and so on. However, you do get enhanced visibility. So reporting is part of an incident. It's easier for the analyst to report back to the client and understand exactly what activity has happened and how this fits in. In terms of correlation rules, keep it simple. Focus on the operations. Don't try to map actor techniques, because actors will change their techniques a little bit, but some of the techniques will always be fairly static. Weirdness, you'll come across it. I did. So deployed it on live host. Then I saw PowerShell scripts running, and it was just running for infinity. It was running netstart command, checking to see what ports are open, and then it was clearing the ports, and then just keep doing it and doing it. Initially I thought that's some kind of weird behaviour, is that some kind of beaconing, or is that something else happening? Apparently it was a performance issue on the host. It was an Exchange server, and apparently it's got a habit of hogging the ports and the resources on the host. So the system administrator deployed a PowerShell script. It does happen. There's fixes out there, legitimate reason for doing it. But as an analyst, you're going to get your SYSMON log flooded with all of this activity. So you do have to do a bit of tuning. Blind spots. If someone use some malware and it evades the AV, SYSMON might not classify those events, but you might be able to spot outliers. So, for example, if an exploit is used to get system privilege, the next step might be to create user accounts. So SYSMON might, and the attack matrix might not be useful for that, but using the Windows security logs. So don't constrain yourself too much on the SYSMON logs. Going forward, I'm in the process of upgrading SYSMON to version 10. This provides DNS login for the process and reporting of the original file name. So a bit of a game changer. I'm not even seeing this functioned in EDR solutions either. Swift on Security has released an updated SYSMON config file. So that provides mapping to the attack matrix TTPs as well. So now we've got two configs, OLAF and Swift on Security. Adversary emulation, that is maturing. So TI reports are featuring TTPs and so on against the metric. And vendors are starting including them. So from a readiness point of view, concluding slides. So the security analyst perspective, the attack matrix is a game changer, it's invaluable. So the security analyst is kind of moving more away from reactive to more proactive, understanding the events, starting to be more threat aware, understand what's happening in the environment, the host and so on, which makes the security incident escalation more valuable to the client, because we can provide that more context detail. However, the analyst still needs to understand the environment, understand how the hosts are deployed, the configuration, what we're visible to, what the critical hosts are, and so on. And I still recommend that exercising is done, either from external pen testing and so on, just to get the analyst understanding. Have we covered all the techniques we need to? The previous presentation talked about prioritization. We're going through that same pain, because my view is that we shouldn't be going for zero false positive. We do need to capture stuff because there is legit activity. But you shouldn't be getting a full coverage of the attack matrix because, as mentioned earlier on, some techniques just aren't applicable to the environment you're trying to monitor. So at a basic level, you should be able to detect all the techniques being used. Then at the next level, you should start prioritising the techniques and then mapping that onto an operation where it could be form part of an attack. So, last slide. Here are some of the excellent references that I use. Most of the resources you should be familiar with. The last item is the detection lab. So if you really want to quickly spin up some virtual machines, a Windows server, hosts and so on, then there's some scripts what do that. There's a couple of other things I've not included on there. There's something called Sigma. So they provide generic security rules, and that's been quite a useful resource for correlation as well. You can start to use that for security monitoring environments, start looking at what techniques you should be looking for. And if you're trying to get into the attack matrix or trying to get up to speed on this, then there's a couple of data sets out there. So MITRE's released a data set called BRAWL, BRAWL. It's about 3 gig in size, but I think there's 11 gig version, and that has a lot of data in there with a lot of bad activity, so it's quite good to test that. So, thanks for listening. That's me done. Yeah.